All right, we're going to get started now.
Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful worship service this morning. It is just a delight to be with you, from the beautiful classically inspired music to the great hymns and sharing the Lord's Supper with you. And you laid your hands on me. It is so seldom that scientists get prayed for. It just is such a blessing. And Pastor Jim's sermon has a lot of resonances with things I'm going to get to later in my talk. So I wanted to talk, well, tomorrow night I'm going to talk more about astronomy. But this morning for us as people of God, I wanted to address some of the challenges that we are facing of how to live and act faithfully as God's people in a time when science has become the focus of so much division in our culture and within our Christian communities. So here I am as an astronomer at the telescope here. This is the Very Large Array Radio Telescope. And there was a new image that came out just a few weeks ago that was produced by a telescope similar to this. If you want to Google this one, Google Meerkat Telescope Radio Galactic Center, or something like that, and it'll probably come up. And there's the image. This image is at radio wavelengths, so our eyes detect visible wavelengths of light, but if you stretch out the light to longer wavelengths, you get infrared light and microwave light and radio light. We're used to thinking of radio as coming from the antenna in the center of town, and it goes to your car radio, and then it gets converted to sound. But what we have here is radio waves from the center of our galaxy that are traveling 25,000 light years across space to be picked up by a telescope, and instead of being turned into sound, it's turned into an image. And it is just full of amazing colors and structures. And these large circular things here, those are the remains of supernova explosions, where a star died hundreds, thousands, millions of years ago, and that expanding bubble of that explosion can still be detected, even though now this one is like 100 light years across. When you see images like this and other things out in space, we're filled with a sense of wonder. And as Christians, that wonder becomes a sense of awe because the heavens are declaring the glory of God. Now, that psalm, as we've been singing about all morning, this psalm goes on to say that the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The first half of Psalm 19 is about the wonders of the natural world, God's world, and the second half of Psalm 19 is about the wonders of God's word. And these two come together in these beautiful ways, as we already saw in the Belgic Confession. Now, I did not grow up in the Christian Reformed Church. I grew up in a wonderful evangelical church, but this was new to me when I met my husband, who did grow up in the Reformed Church. That's how I got the Dutch name. It's from him. And he showed this to me. He's like, Deb, you got to read this. I think you're going to like it. And I'm like, okay. The means by which we know God. We know God by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe. Yes, first. I love that's first. Since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God, his eternal power and his divinity. Second, he makes himself known to us more openly by his holy and divine word, as much as we need in this life, for his glory and for the salvation of his own. And we know most ultimately in the person of Christ, as we learned this morning. So Christianity has been pro-science from the beginning, from the scientific revolution with figures like Galileo and Kepler and Boyle, who wrote in beautiful ways about their Christian faith and how it intersected with their scientific work, how the science they were learning built up their faith and even promoted their virtues and gifts of the Spirit. So these things go together. And yet we are in an era of incredible conflict today. Our world has become, and I'll try not to dwell on this too much because we've all been living through it, but I'm sure you've noticed it's become aggressively polarized. It's like every single issue people are rushing to identify which of two camps it falls in. They won't let anything be neutral in the middle. And in that sort of world, you end up with science somehow has ended up on the blue side, and faith has somehow ended up on the red side. And for people like me, and I know some of you, when you are a scientist and a believer, it's just baffling. Like, why are these things separate? These things go together. So, okay, I got to tell my joke about cats and dogs. So the dog says to his owner, "Boy, you spend time with me, you feed me, you take care of me, you must be God." And the cat thinks, "Wow, my owner spends time with me, takes care of me, feeds me, I must be God." Okay, I'm more of a dog person than a cat person. But they're looking at the exact same information and coming to very different conclusions. We're now living in a world where people aren't even looking at the same information. But today's conflicts didn't come out of nowhere. If you look back in the history of science, there's been many times where people are eager to have a conflict narrative, from Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, the reaction to that. How do we understand evolution as Christians? We have in the 20s the Scopes monkey trial over evolution. Henry Morris published The Genesis Flood in 1960. That was really the launch of the modern young earth movement. Jeff Harden here has edited a book about the warfare between science and religion, and how it's this idea that wouldn't die. It just keeps coming up over and over again, even though it doesn't have a lot of basis. Unfortunately, it means that Christians are just primed to see conflict with science. So you get things, and so as I came alive in my professional career in the 90s and the aughts, we had these new atheist voices like Richard Dawkins, who were, and this would be the militant atheists. I think we all have met plenty of atheists who are not as against religion as some voices, but somehow the most extreme voices get most of the press. So Richard Dawkins wrote about our origins. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, if you're an astronomer like me, you know that the science of the universe doesn't say anything of the sort. It's neutral on these questions. If you're a person in the pew, you go, well, that's wrong, and you know from your Christian faith that that's wrong, and if that's what science is saying, then you're going to reject science as well. And that was my experience growing up in an evangelical church. Was we knew that either the earth was young or it was the atheist evolution Big Bang stuff, and we didn't know of any other options. And when those are your only two options, you're going to pick the God side. So then you end up with vocal Christians on the other side rejecting science. Here's Ken Ham, president of Answers in Genesis, and saying the ideas that they're the fallible ideas of man that say the earth is old. And unfortunately, you get feedback from the most extreme voices, and some of it happens when you might be, say, leaning to one side or the other, and then you hear an extreme voice on the other side, and you go, nope, that's wrong, and you end up shifting even more to your side. And I think that's happening a lot in our culture, and it's hard when those extreme things just keep popping up in the news and go, oh, that's just horrible. Especially when we were isolated during the pandemic and we couldn't have some of those more moderate in-person kinds of interactions. When all you're seeing is what's online, you really get this distorted impression. So we have this amping up of the polarization, and it has a real impact on people. Rosalind Picard is an MIT professor and now a Christian, but she talks about how she decided to be an atheist because she just got the impression as a kid that all the smart people were atheists, and she was smart, so she figured that's the way to go. She has come to faith in God, and you can hear her on the Biologos podcast and elsewhere. Christian young people, similarly, we tell Garrett's story at Biologos, feel often in this crisis of faith, of like being forced to choose. He grew up in hearing a lot about young earth positions, and when he started actually in his 20s learning about the scientific viewpoint, he said it felt like science had blown up my entire worldview. There are a lot of people feeling that sense of their faith getting blown up. It's less so about evolution now, it's more about other things, but that sort of faith crisis is quite common. Even in 2018, nearly half of church-going teenagers agreed that the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world. So it's serious. So this is about where we were when BioLogos was founded in 2009. Francis Collins is the founder of BioLogos. He directed the Human Genome Project. He directed the National Institutes of Health, and he is, as of last week, the Presidential Science Advisor. And what we value at BioLogos is this mix of these three things: Christ-centered faith, rigorous science, and gracious dialogue. So we brought those together in the issues of evolution and creation and are beginning to address other issues. But we want to show that we're a faith that follows Jesus Christ. And to show that that Christian faith, the historic Christian faith down through the ages, is relevant for today's scientific questions. We want to inspire authentic faith for today's scientific world. And rigorous science, we want to show what the science actually is. What does science actually show through well-established evidence? And where do people make claims that go beyond it in the name of science? Where is science genuinely uncertain and undecided? We seek to explain that in a context of Christianity, and to do it in a spirit of gracious dialogue. So, yeah. Increasing polarization in the last decade, the last couple of election cycles, during the pandemic, all of these things are going on. And you can read that list. We've all been living through it. And as I mentioned earlier, it just grieves my heart that science has gotten wrapped up into this, that all of the polarization, everything feeding into that, has somehow gotten focused on science a lot of the time. There's a lot of other polarized issues going on as well. I actually thought in March of 2020, I remember praying with my team that, well, this deadly virus has arisen, but maybe this is the common enemy that we can unite around. Maybe this is the thing where we can set aside some of our polarized divides, and yeah, that sure didn't happen. And it's distressing, and instead things have gotten much, much worse. So COVID-19 happened, and as I expect you know, that white evangelicals are the people least likely to be vaccinated. Large numbers have been, it's just a lower percentage than other numbers. Something, I didn't check the latest, 60-ish%, whereas atheists are something like 95% vaccinated. And for those who understand the vaccines, these are very safe and very effective, and are something we encourage everybody to take advantage of. At BioLogos, we have sought to explain the science around vaccines and around masks in a Christian context, to give a Christian motivation for doing it. There's a lot of neutral presentations of the scientific evidence. Here's what the science says, we recommend you be vaccinated. Answers your scientific questions. But it rarely taps into all of our Christian values. So at BioLogos, we sought to do that. We published common questions. Should we trust science? Should Christians get vaccinated? That last one, that article has been viewed, 300,000 times, I think, on our website. And we had 2.5 million visitors to our website last year. So a lot of people are finding us. Not nearly enough, given the need out there, but a lot of people are finding it. And I want to also mention climate change as another issue that's getting worse. If evolution was the big issue on everyone's minds in like the 90s and the aughts, it's just not on people's minds right now. On some people it is. Some places I go, and it's the number one issue they want to talk about. But all the COVID-19, everything with the pandemic, and things about climate change are very top of mind now. And how do we respond to this as Christians? I mentioned here our new curriculum called Integrate, which climate change especially is, we're handing this issue off to the next generation who's going to have to live with it. And what we do in the Integrate curriculum is help students understand at a deeper level. Their tagline is deeper science, deeper faith, to understand what the scientific evidence is, and also to how to have conversations graciously with people that you disagree with. The Integrate curriculum goes alongside all of high school biology, all the topics that come up there. And it's great for any parent. You can use it with your kids in public school. Some things are appropriate for middle school, most is high school, some up to college, so there's a lot of great resources there. And this is, the scary thing is now when we have polarized debates around science and faith, the consequences are so much higher. They're for people's health, people's livelihoods, people's lives. It asked me this morning of like what has been rewarding and scary, and I never thought I would be putting out messages that might actually save people's health. I mean, because I got into this all on the origins questions, but we had somebody write to us, like April of 2021 when the vaccines were out, and they said, I've been debating and going back and forth, and I was really nervous about getting the vaccine. I didn't think this was right, and then I listened to your podcast, and I'm still not 100% sure, but I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go, and I'm going to get vaccinated. It's like, whoa. We were actually key in that tipping point for that person to make that decision. But the stakes are higher. The stakes feel higher in a lot of ways. So we're in a situation where things like this happen. So a Christian friend told me this story recently. He said, I told my mother I accepted the Big Bang, and she was upset. So I asked her why the Big Bang was a problem, and she said, because that's what scientists say. Full stop. She didn't come with an argument about scientific evidence. It wasn't a biblical objection. It wasn't because the Bible says it's wrong, but because scientists said it and they're on the opposite side. Oh, okay. So that's distressing. And one last slide here about the problem, and then I'll get on to some ways forward for us. This is one of the few graphs I've seen come out that reflect what we're sort of experiencing anecdotally, that has recent enough survey data and tracking over a long period of time. So this graph goes from 2000 to today, and every couple of years they've asked a question. Let's see, do you have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community, only some confidence, or hardly any confidence? And the blue line is Democratic, gray is independent, red is Republican. It's pretty steady and pretty similar across all of their groups. Science was bipartisan for decades. And then here, since 2018 to 2021, we have this split. And among Republicans, confidence in the scientific community is decreased. Among Democrats, it's increased. Were Democrats that unsure about science before? I don't think so. I think it's become this virtue signaling thing, like saying, this is now a political position I hold because I'm Democrat. I trust science. And which, as a scientist, I'm like, great, positive science message, but there's something going on here that now science has become this weapon in the culture wars. I'm pro-science, I'm anti-science. And you hear it in sort of the tone of voice. People will say, well, just trust the science. And usually there's a lot more to it, there's more nuance, but what people hear is just that phrase, just trust the science. And you know how that sounds to somebody who's unsure? It sounds like, shut up, you're stupid, just trust the science, don't ask any questions. Or it sounds like, trust in science, don't trust in God, trust in science instead. And that's not what's intended, but that's kind of how people hear a lot of that. So we need some better messages that help people understand some of the complexities of that. So that's my first way forward here, is how we communicate about science. And for those of you like me who are science-minded, we know what the evidence is, and we really want to share it with people because it's really cool and it's very convincing. And on whatever the scientific topic is, we want to just start talking about the evidence. And what you have to always remind yourself is that doesn't change anybody's mind. If they are not interested, if they don't trust you, if they're not very science-minded themselves, just hearing about the scientific evidence when they're already skeptical just has very little effect. Here's what might have an effect. Well, okay, so you should, pull out your scientific argument. We need to counter the misinformation out there. There's a lot of it, but we need to do more than that. They're not going to listen. So what do you do? So first of all, you have to work within relationships of trust. So that means family, friends, churches, people trust their primary care physician. What are the voices that people trust? And working within those works. And I don't think I have it coming up here on the list, but part of it is, it's not that you have to say something new about the scientific evidence, is that the research shows people just need to hear it multiple times from multiple directions, from different kinds of voices in their lives, and eventually that can change hearts and minds so that people can, say, take advantage of a life-saving vaccine. Unfortunately, this puts a lot of weight on pastors, and pastors are in crisis right now. I hope your pastors aren't. I think things seem really good here, but there's a lot of pastors who are very burnt out, and the thing is, they're often the most trusted leader in their community. So one thing we're trying to figure out is how can we support pastors in this? Because they could make a huge difference, but they're getting it from all sides. Okay, what else we can do? Acknowledging the limits of science. Often trust the science becomes shorthand for, like, that's the one-word justification for complex public policy issues, when you really need things like economics to come into play, what's best for the community, what's best for mental health, what's best for our children in schools. These are complex questions, and it's so sad when they get reduced to one side saying, just trust the science, this policy is right, or I don't believe COVID's even happening on the other side, and there's just no fruitful conversation in the middle where we desperately need it. Acknowledging the limits of science can actually help with that. Educating about uncertainties in science, and this is a hard one for me as a scientist too, because I want to say, look, the evidence is really convincing, but often what people need to hear and to help them understand is where there are uncertainties, where the science doesn't know for sure yet, or this is the best data we have, or where you have to weigh competing risks and things aren't entirely clear. Cancer doctors and healthcare workers often have to do this with patients and talking about, this treatment, it has some data behind it, we're not sure if it'll work in your situation, are you willing to try it? It's those kind of complex conversations we have to have sometimes. Okay, and here's a big one that we as people of faith can do, is showing where God is in the picture and showing the value of humans. This comes from research by Elaine Howard Eklund. She's a sociologist at Rice University. She's done a lot of surveys on what scientists think about religion, what religious people think about science. And one of her projects surveyed people of multiple religions, not just Christianity, and multiple scientific topics. And themes that she noticed across all of that is what religious people want to know is not the weight of the scientific evidence so much as, is God still in the picture somewhere? Where's God in the picture? And two, are humans still valuable somewhere? How are humans being valuable? If you skip over those points, you're missing a lot of what religious people are interested in and need to hear about. So that is something as Christians that we can convey. My last piece of advice on this is from Catherine Hayhoe. You can hear her on the Biologos podcast, and the last interview we did with her, she kind of puts the challenge in front of everybody. You tell me what you care about, what you value, and I'll tell you how it's impacted by climate change. She'll do it for anything. And her point is, you don't have to change your values to start caring about climate change. It already is affecting things that you value, and you can care about it for those reasons. And making those kinds of connections is really important. So these are things that have been found through research and experience to be helpful. You might not use much of this yourself, or you might use it a lot depending on your vocation and situation. Okay, second big point is gracious dialogue. Something we need to practice because it's hard and it's going to take a lot of practice to figure out how to do it. And model, because there are so few models out there, and this has just gotten only much, much worse over the last few years. Martin Luther King Jr. has this essay, A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart, sermon probably, and it refers to how science and religion can work together, which is why I was reading it, but it had this wonderful line in there. The shape of the world today does not permit us the luxury of soft-mindedness, but we must not stop with the cultivation of a tough mind. The gospel also demands a tender heart. And over I'm hearing from people that even beyond any of the particular arguments, it's the tone of gracious dialogue that matters to them. Everyone is so upset and tired of the constant battles in our culture. The problem is a lot of people just want to then blame the other side. They're the ones causing the problem. But when people finally hear examples of gracious, thoughtful, informed dialogue, they're like, oh, that's what I've been seeking, that's what I've been looking for. And so we need it. And especially surveys of the rising Gen Z, this really matters to them. So what does it look like? So, this time all the bullets are up here from the beginning, so you can see all of them. Here's things we've learned over the years, most of this from discussing creation and evolution, but a lot of it applies to any science topic you're debating or any topic you're debating. Respecting the other person's intelligence. So starting by saying, wow, your view is stupid, that just does not go anywhere. And even thinking it in the back of your mind, like part of the spiritual discipline for me is to, even in my own thoughts, to be cultivating these sorts of viewpoints. Respecting the other person's faith, saying, well, you think that, so you're not a genuine Christian. That also just stops all conversation and is really not very respectful. So instead what you need to do is ask honest questions. And sometimes the last thing you want to do is hear about your crazy relative's idea about some topic, but sometimes asking questions is the only way to get there. And as you're listening, here's another one. Don't spend the whole time listening thinking about how am I going to respond. Actually try and listen to what they're saying. Whew, that's a hard one. A goal is, can you state their view in a way that they would say is accurate? Do you actually really understand what their view is? And I think the next one is really powerful. If you're listening to the underlying reasons for the way they hold those views. So why does it matter so much to them? Like your average person in the pew, what is it about it? Because it usually isn't the surface science issue. It's usually something deeper. When it's talking about, say, evolution and the Big Bang, almost always it was scripture, their view of the Bible. The whole Bible was at stake. Well, hey, then let's talk about the Bible. We don't have to talk about like evidence for the age of these rocks and radiometric dating. Let's talk about the Bible if that's really the underlying concern. And often when you get to those underlying things, like somebody say, well, I'm not sure about getting vaccinated. I'm hoping, I was talking with a young woman, I'm hoping to get pregnant. I'm worried about, the impact on that. Well, it turned out that the reason for not getting vaccinated is because she was caring about her children or fertility. Well, let's talk about that aspect and not whatever the other surface things are. So you can build on shared values of family and health and good things for our community. Now, being gracious, it doesn't mean you have to be like sugar-coated. Like falsely gracious is about the worst thing. It's okay to be honest about your views and honest about even where you've been hurt. And this is something I've learned from some of the dialogues that I've been a part of on race, that asking people to just be gracious and not express any anger isn't not very respectful when they've experienced a lot. But there's ways to do it and ways to do that can convey that honesty while also being respectful of others. Be willing to say, I don't know. Ooh, that's a hard one. Because sometimes we don't, and it feels like a position of weakness, but I have seen, like, somebody's been going at me, are you sure about the age of the universe? Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? And I'm like, I'm absolutely sure. It's billions of years. And like, well, could there ever possibly be a future in which you might someday get evidence that would show you it wasn't? And I'm like, well, maybe. And they're like, oh, okay then. It's like they want to see that there's something that you're willing to say, I don't know, that you're willing to change your mind, and that can be really helpful when that is actually the case. And here's a big one I learned from the founders of BioLogos, from Daryl Falk, who led it. Speak as if you're face-to-face. Now, see, this is where social media just lets you go wild, but if you can speak as you're face-to-face, as if you're having a cup of coffee together, as if you're worshiping beside one another, that's the tone in which we should be talking to one another about challenging issues. I learned this through a dialogue project we did with people who hold other views. So here's our evolutionary creation fans. Here's the old Earth creation, young Earth creation. We ended up publishing books together on dialogues. And you know how these happened? Spending weekends together in person without any cameras or audience, nobody's watching, and actually asking each other honest questions, sharing our testimonies, eating together, worshiping together, and finally getting to some of those hard questions. And then at the end of that, you're like, wow, yeah, you're my friend. I can say what your view is, why you disagree with me and why I disagree with you, and you can get to that point. I don't think you can get to that through Twitter and Facebook. It takes like having meals together. So, okay. What time? Oh, I want to allow time for discussion. My last big point here was Christ-centered faith, and I think just about every one of these subpoints was made in the sermon this morning. So I won't spend as long here. But the big point is that our hope and our motivation, our strength to go on, does not come from science. There's a weird kind of scientism going around now, like, well, science is the source of truth, I'm going to trust the science. That's not going to help you get up the next morning when things look really despairing, when the circumstances give you no cause for optimism. How do you still have hope and keep going? And it is because we are following Christ. We are following Christ and imitating him. It's because we know how the story ends. It's because we are not our own. We are not on our own, and we are not our own, but we belong body and soul to our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And he calls us to imitate him in all of these ways. You know how God responded to the problems of this world? We've just heard it. He created, and then, and then he showed up. The response of the Creator to our suffering was to come in person and be here with us and sacrifice for us. When we see the suffering and struggles in the world, the people who've declared themselves our enemies are behaving like that, we imitate Christ when we show up and listen and sacrifice for them. That's the hope to which we are called, and the Holy Spirit strengthens us in that. Thank you.
So we just, thank you so much, Deb. I so appreciate that, and it's so helpful in so many different kinds of ways. And we have about 10 minutes for some conversation, and would love to have some questions from anyone that you might have, that this sparks for you, that you'd like to ask Deb to expand on or unpack some more.
Or comments on your experiences. I would love to hear how things are playing out in your world on these kinds of questions.
Yes. Is that Tiffany? Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. I have a weird perspective because I am not American, I'm Canadian, and yet this is still playing out in very similar but different ways. Thinking about your first point about going through networks, thinking about churches, primary care physicians, etc. My family is from a small town wherein everyone, churches, primary care providers, friends, etc., are all very polarized in a specific direction. And for me, that has led to many difficult conversations with my family as to trying to get them vaccinated and things like that. How, when the network is set up against you, how can you kind of try and create a dialogue in that sorts of situation?
That is so hard.
Could you repeat the question for anyone watching?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So you're Canadian, I think you said, and referring to times where, and I know this too, there's like a small town where all the churches, all the doctors, all the families, everybody is, say, anti-vaccine, and you want to try to get some, try to show them that these vaccines are life-saving and safe and effective. How can you even get in there? Oh man, that's hard. The echo chambers in our culture are hard, and the networks of trust have become infiltrated with all sorts of disinformation, and it's just firmed up. And to be honest, I haven't heard a lot of success stories. I know a lot of people who've tried. I've heard a lot of stories of family gatherings being completely split over this, families fracturing over it, churches fracturing over it. I haven't heard a lot of success stories, so I'm really unsure how we get past that. I know that kind of thing can work, but when you've got a whole network closed against you, I don't know. I mean, you would hope they would go online. You know, you'd like to, please send them to BioLogos. We'd be happy to, you know, that gets the narrative there. But whether that's heard by anybody is the question.
Yes. Here, you know what? I'll just bring the mic to you.
I just wanted to ask, like, to me it seems like there's so much more underneath what people are openly complaining about. So if they're complaining about wearing a piece of cloth over their face, it's almost like a question of freedom. And I don't know how people come to that. And I think through underneath everything that's going on is a lot of fear. And I don't know what it is a fear of. And I've been thinking about that. I don't know how to define that, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
You raised a couple of important issues there. Yeah, fear and uncertainty and stress, that's what we all experienced during the pandemic. And under those circumstances, you just circle the wagons and you go with the trusted sources you know. That's what you do. And you believe those because the world is just too uncertain and scary. And so that's some of how this happens. But you raised a point before that, which, the freedom thing. So religious freedom is an issue in our country. There are situations where the right to freely express our religion is impinged on, and I mean, if Christians don't talk back, it's not going to happen. Things like government policies to say fund all sorts of daycare sites, but not the ones that are associated with churches, you know, like things like that. Why not? We want to do a Christian daycare. Vaccination is not a religious freedom issue. Russell Moore has written quite convincingly about this, and he knows about the actual religious freedom issues, but somehow it's gotten attached to that. And you get these weird things where you have some, you know, very vocal Christians saying, all about my freedom, my rights, my me, don't impinge on me. And then you have people who don't know my Lord and Savior at all saying, I'm willing to sacrifice myself and do whatever it needs to care for other people. And I'm just like, the world is turned upside down. What is going on? So a lot of this just comes through the networks people are listening to. I blame social media for so much of this. It has just promoted echo chambers like crazy. And just the way those algorithms work, there is even foreign forces who will do things just to try to get clickbait. And so they'll amplify up whatever is getting a lot of clicks. And you can get whole Christian websites where most of the traffic is dominated by people who are just in there for profit and not actually having to. And then, you know, people come and they read this stuff and go, well, I guess that's normal now, those extreme voices. And I guess this is a religious freedom issue. And I'm really worried because it just took us just a few months to get to this point, and I feel like it's going to take a generation to get out of it. I pray that it does not take that long, but yeah.
Hi, I really appreciate you coming. I have a background in science and taught for a short time at a private school, and I used your resources a lot when working with kids, especially who hadn't heard any of that perspective before. So it was so helpful. My question is, you talked about one of your strategies, you talked about like sharing like the limitations of science or like acknowledging those things. And one experience that I've had is that sometimes when I do that, the person that I'm talking to latches onto that so quickly as like, oh, you're right, you agree with me. They just go back and forth, they're making it up, they're changing, and it's like they're trying to draw me into that side, and I feel like it almost increases they're trying to figure out what side I'm on, and I'm not sure how to defray that and say like, no, I'm not trying to criticize the scientists. I'm not trying to criticize. I don't think everyone falls into that category. Does that make sense? And so I'm trying to figure out how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I can just see that conversation playing out. You know, you acknowledge that science is limited, science doesn't have all the answers, science is sometimes uncertain, and people are like, yep, I knew it, and then they just stop listening. I think I meant that as coupled with also a robust statement of where science is reliable. So there's finding that balance. Sometimes people are determined to not listen, and then there's not much you can do. One thing we're hoping at BioLogos in our theory of change is that although a lot of people are hardening in the extremes, there is still a fairly large middle, perhaps the muddled middle, the frustrated middle, who is looking for something better. And if we can put in front of them a narrative that is sympathetic to their questions, honest questions and concerns and confusions people have, that can be something I'm hoping we can equip pastors, teachers, and so forth with a narrative that could then work and get out into more circles. And not saying that science is always right is a piece of that, but it has to be in the larger mix, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Or comment?
So I love that you're here talking to us, and thinking of my own life, times I've come to trust people who are different enough, who are really different from me, enough to listen to them. Takes a really long time. It doesn't take a conversation. It doesn't take weeks, in my experience. Maybe I'm a hard case, but it takes months. And so part of what I think what you've said to us is so important, but what I'm wondering is anybody talking to scientists and telling them how to be more communicative and to accomplish what they really want? I mean, yeah, that's my question. I guess, and I even mean scientists who aren't Christians.
Right. So you're right that it takes a long time to actually trust somebody you don't already trust and who has a different view. Yes, people are talking to the scientists, maybe not enough, but a lot of the scientists I know genuinely want to know, like, how can I communicate better? Like, they want to communicate, but it just appears an impenetrable wall of suspicion, and they don't know how to get through that. The kinds of messages I put up here are starting to filter out. So right here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there's a researcher named Dietram Scheufele, and his group studies public communication and science communication in particular. And he has an article out, and it's in the American Scientist, and it is about exactly this trust the science narrative and how to word that in better ways. And he's not a person of faith himself, I don't think, but he is really sympathetic to the concerns that religious people have. And he's on big commissions with the AAAS where they're trying to improve science communication. I think in the last 15 some years, it used to be, okay, when like in the 90s, what I saw was that scientists were like, yeah, okay, the religious people, they'll eventually fade away or come around or whatever. And eventually it dawned on them, this is a large voting bloc, and that's going to affect our funding, and, even just for very pragmatic reasons, but often more open-hearted reasons of like, these people are in my classroom, how do I communicate with them? And so there's been a much bigger move to try to help scientists who aren't religious themselves know how to talk to religious people. Send them to BioLogos is a piece of that, but also other things in public messaging.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. One thing I'm going to take away from this is that the work that actually happens in the local church, where we have face-to-face conversations with people who are different from us, is where we're a training ground for doing a lot of this, and it's an encouragement to us to have you with us and to be helping us to think about it. And so we're really grateful, and thanks so much. We're looking really forward to tomorrow night and for everything else. So thank you again.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. One thing. There are brochures about BioLogos on the back welcome table, and also a sign-up to get on their mailing list. So please stop by there on your way out. And Marcia has something for us.